Good morning. Happy New Year or happy new school year, that is. Did you miss me? I'm really, really excited to share with you a walkthrough of how the first day of my graduate seminar on playing the 18th century went. This is take two of this live. The first time I did a half an hour right after class, super high energy, all the way until the gas let out, and the audio didn't record. Thanks, Firefox. You're swell. So, we're doing a little bit of a recreation today. It seems appropriate for kind of what we're talking about and the meta of it all. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what the course is designed to do and show you what my students saw on the very first day, both in terms of the assigned games and texts and the games and text that the students are going to have the ability to adopt. Because this is the class day that requires luggage. This is now empty, and I have, for the sake of streamlining, organized my text into two piles on either side of me. And of course, as you can see, there's a lot more games behind me. And so the nice thing about this class is that it's actually rather small, even for a graduate course. So there's the possibility that students will actually come and hang out in the game library and get a wider sense of the field of games and game studies. And that's because this is an amazing group of folks. This class is officially an 18th century studies class. So it's designed to introduce students to the 18th century in all its weird and wonderful facets. We are using the theoretical lenses around game studies to think about the ways in which the 18th century gets refracted in our own period. So, the structure of the course is basically a trilogy plus one of game and text pairings. And at the very end, the students will have control over the final text and game pairing. We'll vote in mid semester about what that's going to be. This is, like all of the other courses that you'll see me talk about on this website, one that is really about student agency. I am not the sage on the stage, I'm the guide on the side. I do a lot of talking today, but as with a good role-playing game, success comes if and when there's a moment where I get to sit back and let both the engagement and the expertise of my students shine. So that's what we're working towards. That's the central metaphor. Talking about what role playing games are is the kind of first thing that we talk about. And in past courses, that has been incredibly necessary because most of my students have never played a role playing game before. A little bit different this time. Almost all of the students have some experience playing a tabletop role playing game. That said, all of them have either played Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder. And of course, we're going way beyond that. And as we've talked about a little bit on this channel in the past and in other spaces, one of the challenges of having a kind of group of folks who have experience with D20 systems like Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons is we kind of break some of the expectations about what role playing games are in order to kind of work it out. So, interestingly, the student who has the least experience, which is to say no experience, may actually take to this more easily, at least in my pedagogical experience. And certainly, I got to watch over the course of class that student fall in love with the idea of tabletop role playing games, which was very, very cool. So, one of the first things that we do in all of my classes is that we start by playing a very simple role playing game. You may be familiar with For the Queen. For the Queen is a staple of all of my teaching. You can see behind me in my teaching cabinet of multiples, I've got lots of copies because I often teach up to 30 students in a class. We only needed one box this time, but we didn't use this box. we used this new box that Darrington Press had sent along earlier this summer. Um, there was a possibility, and we might actually come back to this, of comparing the ways in which the two editions of the game are different beyond just the kind of translation of different queen art, which we did start to talk about. And the way, because we were talking about the ways, what are the mechanics of this game? Well, the obvious one is the questions you get asked as you go around the circle, and who gets those questions, and in what combination, which questions even emerge before the queen is under attack, all shape the experience of play. They are variables you can't control for. But also, the choice of queen art, or the idea that the table has about that queen based on the art, is another variable that increases the variety of playability. But finally, and the most important part for the start of the semester, especially as we think about the metaphor of this class as kind of a role playing game, is the players at the table make a big difference. This was the first time that the class was so small that I could play with my students, which no doubt had an effect. Probably less of an effect than it would have with a group of undergraduates, but still a non-zero effect. These are folks who are still getting to know each other in many cases. We've got some first-year master's students as well as some returning students. And all of those are elements of play. And so, one of the things that we were also talking about, and that students are going to kind of read their way into as they write their reflections for Friday, are the different ways that we talk about and assess and understand what games are, how they're different from other forms of art, how we can talk about them as art. And I'm so indebted, as always, to my good friend Evan Torner, who comes to this stuff as a film's kind of faculty member, a specialist in German film, in addition to being, a game professor. So I come to this through fiction. So I think of things in terms of narratology, the structure of stories, and of course, as any good game studies person would tell you, that's only part of the story, so to speak. The mechanics and structures are also important in how we think about them, and the elements of uh, chance and friction and goals and all of those sorts of things. So they're going to be doing some more reading. Um, but we started today, in addition to playing for the queen after going around and doing some why are you here's and establishing again. We have a class that's majority femme, not uncommon for a group of graduate students in the humanities. We have majority experience in gaming of different kinds. Half of this class is familiar with and has watched actual play, and every single one of those has watched Critical Role. And we have my second example of someone saying, "I know about Matt Mercer because of my dad," which that was fun. Um, I also got my first "my dad follows you on social media," which was, "Hi, a student who I will not name for privacy reasons. Dad and mom, you guys are cool, and I'm really excited to have you kind of poking around. This one's for you." So we then walk through the kind of arc of the class. So this is a graduate course, so it's building towards a final project. For literature specialists, which is one track in my department, they're very likely going to be writing a traditional seminar paper, which means picking an object of analysis, doing some research in either ways that people have read similar kinds of objects, finding themselves in a kind of scholarly conversation, all those kinds of good things. But many of our students are either in our technical and professional communications masters or in our creative writing masters. And so they have the option of selecting a portfolio kind of project where they might design a game, they might design pedagogical materials, they might do something creative in some way, shape, or form. Students have done interactive fiction in this course, this sort of thing. In order to make sure that all the scaffolded tasks of learning about critical conversations and all these sorts of things are relevant for everybody, what the creative and design students will end up doing is writing a 10-page critical introduction. So they're going to embed themselves in a scholarly conversation just like everyone else. They will just be doing it from a slightly different angle. And that's going to be particularly important because one of the things that we're going to be focusing on this semester is indeed how we talk to audiences outside of academia. This is, of course, a really interesting preoccupation of mine, both in terms of my, teeny tiny YouTube presence, the writing that I do on occasion for Polygon, my inability to quit many microblogging sites, Instagram photos of the books I'm about to walk you through. So we're going to be talking and having class visitors who are kind of straddling the divide. Some are academics, some are very much not, but all are in many ways people who are speaking to public audiences about the nature of games in their different kinds of methods to allow students to kind of imagine broader possibilities in a time when humanities jobs like mine are shrinking. It's all the more important to have a capacious understanding of what the possibilities of the degree are. So, what are we going to do in this class? Well, starting next week, we're going to be combining, looking at primary source kind of literary text from the 18th century with modern texts that reflect on similar issues. And it doesn't get much more kind of on the nose than combining the early English translations of Bluebeard, which appeared in the early 18th century, the translation of Charles Perrault's version of fairy tales, and the 1812, the first edition of what we think of as Grimm's fairy tales, in conversation with a reading of Bluebeard's Bride. Now, note that I really emphasize Bluebeard's Bride as being read, not played. I cannot run this game, even for a room full of adults, even in a kind of highly controlled scenario, because we are in a classroom. Classrooms are spaces of power dynamics, and while I do practice a open door policy in my course, if a student hits their funny bone, mentally speaking, they can indeed walk out of a game if they find it concerning. So, but it's still like the pressure to stay is very high. So we're going to avoid that, but instead take a look at this as a text and think about how do we read a role playing game. One of the things we started talking about here in week one was the idea that these are nonlinear texts. They open up in particular kinds of ways and hook you in, but ultimately they're designed to be used at the table as kind of reference material. And so for my document design students, this is catnip, right? How is this information organized in a way that's accessible, exciting, and playable? It was also a really useful moment to kind of explain, like, oh, what if you forget a rule? Well, you can either look it up if you really want to, or you can just make something up, right? That these are also um, kind of the same thing as a script is to a play in some ways, which is to say, a script is just the kind of skeleton of a performance. It's not the full-fledged instantiation, and this is that even more so. So luckily, Bluebeard's Bride has and the Bluebeard fairy tales have the helpfulness of being really short, so that we can kind of spend the time, dig deep, compare, and do all that kind of work. Take our time early on in the semester as we're kind of getting into the habit without a whole lot of extraneous stuff. What I love about this is Bluebeard's Bride includes in the gameplay a composite uh, version of the fairy tale, and so it's a little bit of Perrault, it's a little bit of Grimm, it's a little bit of others, but it's from drawing from different editions and editions that had big changes from the early editions of the fairy tale. So we're going to explore the ways in which this is more horrifying and far less didactic than the early versions of of the fairy tale. So we're going to talk about messy differences. So that's week 2 out of 15. And then we're going to spend roughly a month each on 2 different kinds of concepts. The first is a deep dive of Jane Austen's Emma. And this is in direct response to my playing Austen class, where students in their final stars and wishes said, "Hey, this is great. We love this class, but there's a lot of reading." And we were doing all of Austen's work, all of it. And so that's a pretty fast clip. So this time we're trying something a little bit different. We're going to spend 4 weeks reading Austen's Emma. The first and last day of class on the text, we're going to focus on the text itself pretty intensely. Although I'm not assigning the Broadview introduction. Love the Broadview editions, always assign Broadview editions for 18th century texts if they exist. But for the introduction, I am having students read the first 25 to 50 pages of Regency Cthulhu as a way of setting the scene for the late 18th century. Jane Austen's world, uh, I have never seen such an engaging and kind of easy reference and something that doesn't make me want to tear my hair out over nitpicky, stupid details. I do take a little bit of issue about how the text talks about women writers, but again, that's a quibble I can deal with in otherwise, honestly, well researched game. We're not playing Regency Cthulhu. Maybe a student will adopt it and get super hype about it. But the world building setting stuff is a rich text to kind of start us off. We will also be playing a lot of itch.io games. I'm a big fan. If you've bopped around the channel, you'll know my colleague Emily Kugler and I have been researching Austen games, especially the kind of interactive fiction done by Spiral Atlas and Austen inspired games, many of which have never been finished, which on the one hand is kind of a bummer. On the other hand, great for the classroom because it means they're bounded objects in terms of having people take a look at them and not having to take a whole lot of time, which in video games especially is very handy. Um, we will so we'll be bopping around. Students will adopt Austen games. Some of some of the adoptable games I'm going to talk about in a minute, bring their expertise in. We're also going to be folding in student discussion leading that is tied to the new Rutledge Companion to 18th century fiction in English. Or, yeah. Anyway, so that we're also getting a lot of my other friends from 18th century studies and the cool stuff they've recently published on related topics. So with Emma, it's things like Kathy Luby's essay on consent, Ulla Klein's work on sapphic relations, as well as optional like ways that students can go forward with things like disability studies, all that sort of thing. And then after we finish Emma, we will take a full day to play and debrief on Dialect, famously a game about language and how it dies. I've taught this before. It teaches really beautifully in the undergraduate classroom, and I think we're going to be able to run it inside of class without having to run over, making sure that we have time to debrief because unlike the previous time I taught Dialect, this time I am selecting the scenario because we're moving into a discussion on the Caribbean and its representations in the period. And so there is a scenario that is inspired by, it's not like a historical reenactment, but it's a thought experiment inspired by slave revolts, which is something that we're going to be thinking about. This is going to be the test of safety tools in a lot of ways. I'm really glad we have a small class to kind of make sure that everybody is kind of all good. We will, after that, move to a text that is neither 18th century explicitly, although it is drawing from 18th century materials, nor is it a game, but it is, as its poet said to me, a text that is thinking about play. I had the good luck of witnessing M. Norbese Phillips do reading from Zong, and you can go elsewhere on YouTube and find Philip's channel where she has uploaded small versions of the durational readings that she has done, which are, you know, ceremony, all these sorts of things. So I this is a challenge. This is the most challenging text. So we're putting it right smack dab in the middle of the semester, because we've got some experience under our belt, we've got some trust built up, but we're not like sliding into fatigue just yet, because this is a challenging text. This is a text that is based on the Gregson versus Gilbert legal decision. Like all of the language in this poem, this book length poem, is it is from that decision, and that was related to the what we call the Zong massacre, which in 1781, basically the captain of the Zong ordered that 130 Africans be murdered by drowning. They were thrown overboard, basically to collect the insurance money on them as property. And the resulting case was a major landmark in the history of abolition in the period. It formed a lot of the kind of what we would now call discourse in the period. Obviously, like the abolitionist cause in Great Britain took a whole hell of a lot longer to actually, grind its way to something approximating justice. But this is that case was a major moment. This massacre is a major historical moment, which occupied kind of the zeitgeist. And Philip's poem is one that you're not supposed to master or understand, or there's not a singular meaning, but it's an experience. And so when I got the opportunity to ask Philip, hey, is it fair? Is it reasonable? Is it acceptable to think about this text through the lens of play? She said, yes, absolutely. It is a beautiful poem. And that's the approach that we're taking across the 2 weeks that we will be experiencing and re experiencing um, the poem. We'll take a little bit of a break actually in the middle of all this because Big Bad Con is coming. And because Big Bad Con is coming, we have a in-person guest who will be joining us on his way to Big Bad Con. Quentin Smith, the game journalist and critic. You may know him from Quinn's Quest here on YouTube, or if you're more of a board game nerd, Shut Up and Sit Down, and so many other things that he's done across a career that's longer than some of my students have been alive. Um, I'm just teasing a little bit. But so we're going to take a little bit of a break to think about other forms of public communication, public criticism, taste making, thinking through what the possibilities of games are and the experiences that Quinns has had across his career, and answering their questions. We're going to be taking a little bit of a break from specifically 18th century stuff, aside from just like nerding out over stuff. Always helpful when you have a history nerd as your guest. But we will be reading deeply into kind of the recent, both scholarly and completely public journalistic work, thinking about what game journalism has been, the forces that have shaped it. There's a new MIT Press book that's open access, literally called Game Journalism. And so we'll be reading parts of that, as well as Gillen's The New Games Journalism, and Gita Jackson's more recent The New Games Journalism, Same as the Old, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully it'll be a useful kind of reminder that this is not just a conversation that's a quote unquote scholarly conversation, but we are almost always working kind of hand in hand with folks who are doing this work in other professional realms. Once I get back from Big Bad Con, and shepherding, I think at this point, 20 Big Bad academics through that con, very exciting about, we will be visited virtually by my friend Alyssa Sepinwall, who is the author of Slave Revolt on Screen. Students will be reading the second half of this book, which focuses on the Haitian Revolution in video games. The first half is on film. And Luckily, some of the games that Alyssa talks about in her book are available through the Internet Archive, so they can be played kind of in an emulation form, which is very, very cool. So we'll be talking about the Haitian Revolution, and and the history of it, and the history of the ways in which it has been in popular culture. And then finally, around week 5 or 6, the collective will vote on the final weeks of pairings of game and text. And so far, I've created a couple of options. Depending on our conversation, there might be more options that come up. That includes a focus on Frankenstein, a focus on Polidori's the Vampire, or my personal preference, which is to take a look at Harriet Wilson and Her Three Sisters, which is another game by Story Brewers, the makers of Good Society. It's a gossip slash kind of um, blackmail game, but is deeply and intimately connected to the composition of a real text, which is the memoirs of Harriet Wilson, a famous courtesan of the early 19th century. So really, really excited about the possibility. And then also Captain Singleton, or like just thinking about pirates. If we just need to play some Monkey Island or something. Not opposed to that either. Um, so that's the arc of the class in terms of the things that we're all going to be doing together. Students also have a list of text of games that they can adopt um, to play outside of class. And this is because I'm trying not to overload them, but I also want them to have a kind of wide experience. I also want them to be able to craft some of the options that are before them. And so a lot of these I brought to class with me. So, for example, I brought Delaney Tangere, which is interestingly the only 18th century game yet that I have that is not in a non-Western context, which I think is really interesting. This is social climbing, kind of on the other side of the world. Um, so a little bit telenovela-y by its own description in interesting kinds of ways. Just in my inbox, in my mailbox this week is Lilliputian Adventure on the Hot Open Seas, which is Mouse Ritter compliant. So, like Mouse Ritter, which I have fallen in love with over recent weeks as my nephew has learned to run it. It's playing with scale, right? Mouse Ritter is what if OSR, but teeny tiny little mice. And in similar way, Lilliputian is thinking about kind of the mechanics of tininess, and I think interesting kinds of ways. So those were the little ones that students could sit in front of, but I'm really excited about this motherfucker. Can I curse? Yeah, this is for adults. Hi. So this is Teeth. I will never stop being irritated by the fact of the way that it should be the other way around. But I love Teeth. I'm kind of fascinated. I have not yet played it. I've done the thing where you fantasize about bringing all your friends together because I play with 18th century nerds all the time to run this game. Unfortunately, my gaming group that is mostly 18th centuryist is also not super into horror or like creepy, spooky stuff, which is kind of a bummer. This is a lovingly kind of researched deep dive into spaces, places, mindsets, structures of the late 18th century, specifically the 1780s. And thus I love it. And then, of course, it adds, but what if spoopy oopy on top of it? What if you're kind of fighting supernatural forces and all of those sorts of things. So I think one of my students is going to adopt it. Several students kind of did grabby hands with it. One of my brand newbie to role-playing games students sat herself in front of Good Society, and so she may adopt this as her baby. Every semester I teach a game where there's an adopted kind of game. Good Society gets picked. Good Society is something that we're going to kind of obliquely reference throughout. because so much of my scholarship and my collaborator Emily Kugler's scholarship thinks about the kind of ways in which this game tries to solve the Bridgerton problem before the Bridgerton problem, and is an interesting case study in that kind of way. But it is also just a fun game that some of my students really, really like. So we took a look at that today. We did have one board game because one board game fit in the bag, which is, of course, Marrying Mr. Darcy. It's also interestingly the only Austen game I've been able to find so far in any form, board, video, TTRPG, that has the Emma expansion that addresses Emma at all. So we're going to be kind of working slant in terms of Austen games and Emma. So they won't be straight adaptations, but instead, which I think is actually really useful and really helpful in terms of kind of breaking free of ideas around authenticity or kind of nitpicky details as opposed to other ways of adapting. The other kind of darling of the day, and is not surprising at all, is Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. I'm very excited that 500-Year-Old Vampire, which is the version of this game that's designed for classroom use, is a peer-reviewed publication through Central Michigan University Press. And so hopefully we'll be landing in physical form in my doorstep across the semester. And so this is what I would pair with Polidori's The Vampire, I think. I don't suspect, and I'm not really offering this as a adoptable game for my students. Solo games are really hard. I'm happy to do it. I own a ton of solo games because my other classes are obsessed with them. It's also a way of getting around group work. The problem with a class like this is there aren't actually that many 18th century solo games. If you know about solo games that are set in the 18th century or dealing with 18th century themes, please put them in the comments. I will buy them. Because I will buy anything that is even remotely literary if I can. Um, Also not in the box, or in the bag of doom, um, are, like, the big box board games. Obsession is an option for adopting. Students, who pick a tabletop role-playing game will be asked to play at least a 3, session campaign or a long weekend. Um, Students who play a board game, it depends on the crunchiness of the board game. So with Obsession, which is available, thankfully, on Board Game Arena, you can play it a couple of times and you don't even have to set it up. The game, God bless, sometimes playing online is superior. And I find with crunchy games, that's particularly the case. Um, John Company is not, but it is an adoptable option in this course. And my sense is that I would only require that students play it once and call it good because it's a big guy. I don't know that this crowd is super into, that level of crunch, so that just may be something for another day. Also, of course, not tangible things, but that students have links to on Canvas are video games. I try to defer to things that are really inexpensive on Steam that have multiple platform options, or are browser playable. That's a requirement if I'm going to make everybody play it. It's a nice to have on this side. So Emily Kugler and I just introduced our colleagues at the North American Society for the Study of Romanticism, or NASR, to herald a incomplete interactive drama that imagines that Cromwell's protectorate never ended, and so that the British Empire looks very different, and is told through the lens of a protagonist of Indian descent who's on a ship with a kind of worldwide crew, kind of solving mysteries about himself and the world around him. Um, One of my students is super into costume and has been looking into Ambition, a Minuet in Power. There's also another game that involves fashion as a mechanic that's never been finished called Truths Untold, that she might fold into that. And then there's, basically like the mid 2010s were a fascinating time for a bunch of 18th century inspired games. The obvious one is Assassin's Creed, Freedom Cry, but there is also a whole bunch of smaller games from the period that are either kind of going into the thief taker vibes or really a lot about music making in the 18th century, and as well as like, any number of like Austen inspired games or just dating simulators of different kinds. So that's also a possibility. We'll see. What's been fascinating about teaching games over the last couple of years, and of course, to give you context, I have been teaching games since the return to from remote teaching. So, in other words, everything is in the shadow of the experience of completely online uh, educational experiences. And so, what I have found is that when given the choice, students pick something that they can touch, that they can hold, and that they can be with their friends without technology. We'll see if that continues to be true this semester. It's hard, if not impossible, to say how they're going to jump. But yeah, so that is day one of the class, is kind of going over all of these components. And I will be doing recaps like this and I might uh, decide to I'm recording these live because otherwise I will overthink them and I will take the whole day doing shoot after shoot after shoot. Perfect is the enemy of the good. I need to go write a book. So that's why you get a little bit ramblomatic about it, um, so to speak. That's someone else's deal. I digress. But I will be answering your questions about the class, curiosities you might have when I go live, which will either be on Tuesday nights after the class is over, or here on Wednesday mornings when I have recovered from said class. The class is kind of afternoon into evening and is a kind of almost 3-hour marathon. So this is it's great. It's filling my cup. It's super energizing. It's really lovely, but the body will still have needs. So yeah, so if you are following along at home, a reminder that our reading for next week is the early translation into English of Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, as well as a English translation of the very first edition of Bluebeard from the Brothers Grimm. That actually is a little tricky because there was not, as far as I know, an English translation until 2014. Princeton University Press has published it, of that first edition. And the story of the Grimm's fairy tales is that they radically transform in different kinds of ways in terms of selection and things like that, from in those early editions. So 1812 is a little bit different from what comes after, and then the things that actually get translated into English during the 19th century. We will also be reading and taking a look at Bluebeard's Bride, the feminist work of Gothic horror and one of the finest RPGs around. If you would like some additional reading and viewing, I strongly recommend the Bluebeard's Bride actual play Goodia, which came out last year. It's an all non female identified cast. And it is set in a kind of South Asian Desi context. It's also beautifully produced. It's a visual treat to look at. Um, I think that it is no actual play is perfect. That's kind of the nature of actual play, but it is ambitious and interesting in ways that I think are worthy of your time. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week. And until then, I'm going to go uh, collapse. Be well. See ya.